Most of what Tantra is has absolutely nothing to do with sex. And then the tiniest little drop in the ocean of Tantra does have something to do with sexual practices.
3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, the beautiful Karina Guthrie. Karina, welcome to the Brett Shuttleworth Show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, it's such an honor to have you on here and sharing your wisdom, especially with the subject around yoga. It's such a fast, expanding, like, consciousness, and yoga is so much. It's expanding across this world, and a lot of people that want to know what it's all about, and that are interested in partaking in it and optimizing their life somehow through it. It's a subject that I've been dying to speak to you about. So, but before we get there, all right, you have quite an incredible background. Born in Papua New Guinea. I mean, that's an absolute out the left field one, right? Tell me a little bit about that. I know from there you ended up in Australia, but how did that come about?
I don't actually remember anything about it. We left when I was very young, but my parents lived there and worked there for many years before I was born. But my first memories are in Australia, so it's like a cool thing on my life CV, but not something that I have any memory of at all.
I know you're a well-educated woman, which I really, really appreciate. But the one thing that stood out for me is your Bachelor of Arts in Psychology. What drove you to lean into that dynamic in your life?
It actually came about kind of opportunistically. Before that, I was doing an advertising degree and I was doing psychology as my minor or my secondary subject. And I got to the end of that advertising degree and realized that the last thing that I wanted to do was get an advertising job. And I really loved psychology. And I loved, just trying to figure out personality dynamics and, ask big questions about my own life and life in general. And that seemed to be a good option at the time. And so I did that and combined it with philosophy. And there was lots of really wonderful, interesting stuff in that I never used professionally, but still carry with me.
And it took you places. I mean, just for everybody to know that you're a yoga teacher and a teacher trainer on an international level. But before that, even leaning into I know that from there you also had your master degree in international security studies, which took you to the South Pacific as well to work. How was that? How was that experience?
It was really fascinating. I did the Masters in International Security Studies. It was kind of a point of interest for me. It was in that decade after 9/11. And I'd been really fascinated about that. It was something that captured the imagination of, everybody across the world. And I remember I'd started to read lots of books about international relations and politics and conflict and that kind of thing. And I was looking for my next step, and so I did that master's degree. And as part of that degree, I did an internship at this place in Australia called the Office of Transport Security. And they were looking at basically how to stop, like a 9/11 type thing from happening in Australia. And I was in their international relations branch and looking at some of the challenges that they had with aviation security in the South Pacific region. And so I ended up doing my PhD in that, although I quit at the 11th hour to become a yoga teacher. But that was what sent me traveling around the Pacific a little bit, because that was my area of focus.
Mm.
And, I used to speak at conferences and that kind of thing, sharing my research.
Wow, wow. Just what a diverse career. And and you talked about from there you went into yoga, right? I actually met you in Bali. I did one of your classes. You see the shirt I'm wearing today. I don't know what that
Yeah.
means at all. Maybe you can enlighten me.
Yeah, Shri is just like a Sanskrit word that means beauty and auspiciousness. So your t-shirt is just saying that all life is beautiful and auspicious.
Oh wow. Does it fit me?
No big deal.
um, yeah, and so I want to speak to you about that now. You turned from security into yoga. You moved to Bali. I know that you worked with different practices, but you eventually ended up at the practice, a world-renowned practice, as a teacher trainer. And you were also hosting classes. How did that, when you started leaning out of the security, a completely different world, were you searching that yoga came about? Did you sort of, was there a soul searching going on that made you shift from this sort of corporate security world into this yoga free world?
Yeah, for sure there was. I started doing yoga when I was doing my master's, and I was actually living in New Zealand at the time. And somebody said to me, "Let's go check out a yoga class." Their sister was obsessed with yoga, and they wanted to know what this whole yoga thing was about. And so we went and did this yoga class, and I was like, "I think I might be obsessed with yoga too." And I sort of started practicing every day. And fast forward a little bit, I got this job at the university in Australia, and I was working in this security field, but I was doing yoga all the time. And I had this sense that, on the surface of things, it looked like I had a really good job and I was ticking all the boxes, but there was something inside of me that knew it wasn't my thing, but I didn't know what my thing was. And so I would spend a lot of time commuting to and from work. And I was like reading all these books and watching all these TED Talks, being like, this isn't my thing, what's my thing? And I never thought that it would be yoga because I had a real block against that because I thought that if I was a yoga teacher, people wouldn't take me seriously. And, at the time I thought I had a very serious job and that kind of thing. And the school that I used to train at the time hosted their first teacher training program. I went to it just for fun. I had no intention of teaching, and then they offered me a job. And I did that on the side for ages, and by a few kind of twists and turns of fate, I ended up in Bali at another teacher training program that I was attending. And I don't know what it was about that experience, but it was like a light bulb went off, and I was like, oh, this is my thing. This is this thing that's been here all along that I've been searching for but couldn't see. So I
Mm.
went back home and I quit my job and I withdrew from my PhD and ended up living in Bali, training yoga teachers, and eventually where I met you at the practice, where I trained yoga teachers there as well and taught and mentored the staff and that kind of thing.
Wow. And I did a talk in India, and afterwards a gentleman came up to me and said, "Hey, you're a fantastic yoga teacher." And I was like, "No, brother, you don't even understand. I can't even touch my toes." But leaning a little bit into that, I discovered that yoga was not just about exercise or touching your toes or anything like that. So, I mean, you've been doing yoga now for how long? How many years?
About a decade.
About a decade, right? So is there more to yoga than just the consciousness exercise than yoga? I mean, what is yoga? Is there more to it than just this consciousness exercise?
Yeah, for sure. I think actually your experience is so common. If I had $1 for every time I heard somebody say I can't do yoga because I can't touch my toes, I'd have my feet up on a island somewhere now sipping a cocktail. Yoga is a really awesome form of conscious exercise because you kind of go to a class and you do it just because you think it's a good workout or something like that. And then if you do it consistently enough without you really understanding how it's happening, all of a sudden it changes the way that you relate to the world. And you start asking different questions and you start kind of naturally inquiring within a little bit more. And then all of a sudden, this whole world opens up to you, and you're in a new place and you didn't even realize it was happening. I think when it comes to the practice that most people are familiar with, there are a few kind of interesting things about that most people don't know. And One of them is that, the physical practice that most people are familiar with traditionally was just a preparatory step. It was just something that people did to purify the body so that it could handle the deeper work of yoga. And what the physical practice does is actually help you address your relationship with the past. If you think about all the decisions we've made in life, all the things that stress us out, the things we eat, how much sleep we get, all of that sort of stuff, it's all stored somewhere in the fiber of our being. And so we go to a yoga class and we move our body, and it starts to untangle all of those knots and reweave our relationship with our conditioning. And then it prepares us for other things like breath work and meditation, which help us address our relationship with the present and the future in ways that actually point us a little bit more closely in the direction of what yoga is actually about, which is to reconnect with source and realize that we are that.
So would you say that's the primary purpose of yoga then?
Yeah, I think actually similar to what you teach, if you were to try and sum up what yoga is, and it's a vast practice and that's really hard to do, but yoga would essentially say there's a part of everything in creation that's made of energy, and there's a part of everything in creation that's made of awareness. And another way of saying that would be there's a part of us that changes and there's a part of us that stays the same. And most of the trouble that we get ourselves into in life, and most of the reason why we suffer, is because we're over-identified with the part of us that changes, like our physical body, our thoughts and our emotions, our self-image, and that kind of thing. And yoga would say it's real in the sense that, you and I are here having a conversation, but that changing stuff, it doesn't represent the truth of who we are. And if we want to understand the truth of who we are, we have to get in contact with the part of us that never changes. And the only part of us that never changes is awareness or consciousness. And if we can touch that, then we get to touch the part of us that is not bound by time or space. And that's the truth of who we are. And realizing that we already are that is the end game of yoga.
It just blows me away how people misunderstand what yoga is about, and the way you've just put it was so beautiful. I want to lean into the brochure yoga. How can a person tell if their practice is advancing? Because I go into like Instagram and I see someone on one leg, their leg behind the ear, like balancing on one arm. How do you actually measure it if you're actually advancing in yoga? Is it to see what the most strenuous poses, or like I shared with you on Instagram, you go and then there's poses there that you'd have to untangle me for a year. But is that truthfully a reflection of the person's getting of yoga?
No, would be the quick answer to that. We kind of live in cultures and societies that are really achievement oriented. And so we come to yoga and we bring that same achievement mentality to yoga, and we think that that's what it means to progress. And the measure of our practice in yoga isn't achievement, it's awareness. So you could be really strong and flexible and be able to do all the like Insta famous poses, but if you get up off your mat after class and you cut people off in traffic and you're rude to your waiter or whatever it is, then is your practice working? And I would say no, it's not. You could then be the type of person who comes to yoga and never touches their toes, but over time, as the result of your practice, you realize that you are less reactive and more compassionate, and you're kinder and more stable. That is the measure of a maturing practice, more than whether you can stand on your head or touch your toes.
Oh, beautiful. I agree. Like someone can go to church every Sunday and be there but not really connecting to God or their religion per se. Someone that's not going to church is having a first-hand experience with the divine. There is such a significant difference. And I suppose, as you've just shared, yoga is very much aligned with what I'm pointing towards there. But yoga over decades and decades have had different myths about it. And I want to lean into Tantra Yoga, right? the first thing that pops up is like sex and yoga. I know that in the past there's been legendary stories how master yogis sort of manipulate their students and almost get into like a sex orgy, if you will, and use it to their benefits. And while willingly with some of the students coming there as an excuse or vehicle to desire to fulfill those sexual desires. Is anything got to do with sex with regard to Tantra Yoga?
Most of what Tantra is has absolutely nothing to do with sex. And then the tiniest little drop in the ocean of Tantra does have something to do with sexual practices. And I think what most people think of as Tantra these days is just sort of a shorthand way of saying like conscious sexuality, which is certainly a good thing to explore if you want to, but it's not Tantra. Tantra, for example, I teach in a lineage of practitioners that would describe themselves as tantric, and there's nothing to do with sex in that lineage. So interestingly, there are a couple of things about Tantra that I think are interesting in relation to this. One is that it also has this goal of self-realization. And one of the primary ways that it moves towards that is by harnessing the different energy systems in the body in the pursuit of spiritual liberation. Something that happens sometimes when you are building energy in the body is that what you're building is power. And that power can be the power to become everything you're meant to be, like to fully blossom into the highest version of yourself, or that power can empower the ego. And sometimes I think that's when you see people, in sexual versions of Tantra and just in normal yoga practice get themselves in trouble because then, they just build the energy of their ego. Something that I think is really beautiful about Tantra is that prior to Tantra, there were, yoga was around for a very long time, but in a lot of different kind of sub-traditions of the practice, the thought was, if this body is impermanent and not the truth of who I am, then I will deny the body and renounce the world and go meditate in a cave until I become enlightened. And what Tantra says is, well, actually, everything in creation is an expression of the divine, which means you don't have to renounce the world or deny pleasure. Everything in your life can be a celebration of whatever it is that you find most sacred in your life. So Tantra has this belief that we don't have to renounce anything. In fact, we would embrace everything, which means that pleasure can be a doorway to the divine. So where most people are kind of on board with that. But the other part of that equation is if pleasure can be a doorway to the divine, then we have to accept that pain and suffering and loss is also a doorway to the divine. And that is something that we kind of conveniently forget. But if we're going to explore this end of the spectrum, we have to be open to this as well.
I must say, even through consciousness, like when if I've made love, the unison of that love feels like I've connected to consciousness at the end, right? It's just like this wow moment. You don't want to change the split second. It's so profoundly beautiful. And so I suppose, it's leaning into that through that. And I'm glad you shared with that. So those of you that are lining up for these sex classes, you've heard it straight from the horse's mouth, right? This is what it's about. It's about connecting to that consciousness. But something else that I really find interesting in the traditions of yoga is the gods and the goddesses. I find them so interesting. Like Ganesh, right? It has this elephant head, this like human body with 4 arms, and he's riding a mouse. Is that actually real? What did Ganesh actually have that? And what are the purpose of all these? Because there's thousands of gods and goddesses in the yoga sort of mythology or the practices that one experiences. Can you just lean into a little bit of that?
Yeah. I think in the West, we have kind of like a really tough time with the idea that there could be thousands of gods and goddesses and that we think we would have to relate to them as real, and we can't, and so we just reject the whole thing. And I think some people relate to them as real, and I think if that works for you, then go for it. And for people who find that a little bit too big of a leap, then they also work as metaphors. You know, all of these gods and goddesses, they represent different qualities of consciousness and different aspects of our human journey and our spiritual journey. So they I guess they personify the journey that we're on. And they're these very colorful characters, and we can relate to them because they're not perfect and they get themselves in trouble and they have to get themselves out of trouble and all of that kind of thing. All of those, you know, the arms and the different bodies and the, you know, whatever it is, some of them are wearing, you know, necklaces that are skulls and all of that kind of thing. They're just symbols for different things that we need to be aware of as we progress. A little while ago, I can't remember where I heard this, but it really kind of was a light bulb moment for me in sort of, in terms of understanding this. I came across this idea that, you know, for example, a few years ago, my grandmother passed, and she was the last of my grandparents who were alive. And so she had a physical body in the material world that at one point in time I could relate to and touch and see. Now I can't touch or see her in the physical world, but if I think about her in my mind, my relationship to her hasn't changed and she feels as alive there as ever. Cut to figures like Jesus or Buddha. I never met them personally, but they were material figures in the world at some point in time. I have a relationship to them in a similar way that I have a relationship to my grandmother. They're alive in my mind. Cut to the gods and the goddesses. Maybe they never had a material body that anybody could relate to, but I can still relate to them in my mind in the same way that I would Buddha or my grandmother, but the significance they have in terms of their teaching is different. But they're alive in some way, and that's good enough for me.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, I just love the color and the imagination of Hanuman, the monkey, and even Shiva with the snakes crossing the rivers, and it appeals to me so much. And so thank you for explaining that and what that actually means, because I know a lot of people see this like this elephant with four arms and like, oh God, run away, like it's, you know, it's something evil or something like that. So it's another thing that I want to ask you, however, how does mantras and meditation fit into the art or practice of yoga? Is it separate to, or is it part of?
Well, in my tradition, it's the centerpiece of. Mantra is so interesting. And again, it's something that we tend to shy away from in the West, because if a teacher tells us to chant something, we're like, I don't think so. It feels a little bit too much like, you know, chanting Christmas carols or karaoke or something that's just like, nope, not interested. Mantras are sacred utterances, and they're really fascinating because Sanskrit is one of a very few languages in the world for which the vibration of the meaning of the word is contained in the actual word. And that seems really abstract, so I'll try and make it more practical. You know, you can say the word fork, and the forkiness of the fork is not contained in that word. You could call it a spoon or a cat or whatever. It doesn't change anything about the fork. In Sanskrit, you could take the word shanti, which means peace, and the vibration of peace is contained within that word. So if you internally are chanting shanti, 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 over time you will take on the vibrational quality of peace, even if you don't know what the word means, which is different from like normal
mm,
languages.
mm,
So mantra is just the sound form of vibration. And vibration is what holds up the entire universe.
mm,
So, what yoga teaches is that all of these different vibrations live in the universe already. And if we use mantra, for example, in meditation by repeating a mantra that we've chosen or a teacher has given to us, then our job is simply to get still enough that we can hear or receive the vibration that's already there. And
mm.
when we get to that point over time, we'll come to take on the qualities of whatever that mantra are.
Yeah, yeah. And does that apply the same then to meditation, right? Is it the same exercise, wanting to get to the stillness, the quietness, the silence?
Yeah, so there are a thousand different forms of meditation, and mantra meditation is one of them. It's the type of meditation that I do. So I have a mantra. There are certain steps that I do to prepare for that practice. I have a mala where I sort of count the rounds of chanting on, and the mantra is something that I chant silently or kind of receive silently. And over time, I hopefully will become imbued with the qualities of that mantra. And it's a silent practice, it's a very peaceful practice, and you're just trying to get over the like thinky part of that so you can surrender into the experience.
Yeah, yeah. You know, one of the things that I'm an absolute novice in yoga, and I can still just touch my toes. But the one thing that I must share with you that made me fall in love with yoga was the breathing. The breathing like just blew me away. Um, why is it so profound that one focuses so much? Why is breathing used in yoga, and why is it so profound that what the actual yoga does in the practice? As I shared with you, I didn't necessarily fall in line with all the poses, in love with all the poses and that, but it was literally the breathing. And after the class, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm connected to heaven on earth. Why is the breathing so important and
It's
effective?
Yeah, it works on so many different levels. One is the fact that, and I think I said this right at the very beginning, every thought and emotion we have is accompanied by a unique pattern of breathing. So we can change the thought and emotion by changing the way that we breathe. So, just in terms of our very human experience, it's sometimes hard to think our way out of a provoking moment, but we can kind of take a side door through the breath and breathe our way out of it. The other thing is that the breath and the mind, when it comes to meditation, move in tandem. So if we can calm the breath, we calm the mind. And if the breath gets calm enough, it will lead us in a very easy way into an experience of awareness. Something that I find really interesting is that a lot of ancient cultures had the same word for breath as they did for spirit. And there's a recognition that our life force is carried in the breath. If you think about that, our life exists between our very first inhale and our very first exhale,
Mm,
there's
mm,
something in that
mm,
idea that
mm,
the essence of our life force is
mm, mm,
intimately woven with the breath.
mm,
And experiencing that consciously
mm,
is really profound, even if you don't know
mm,
why.
mm, mm,
One of the other things I love about it, just quickly, is this idea that when you breathe in, you're drawing universal awareness and energy into yourself to meet with your individual soul.
mm,
And when
mm,
you breathe out, you're surrendering your individual
mm,
soul to the play of universal
mm.
consciousness. And I feel like whenever I tap into that, it helps me to feel connected to everything else, especially if I'm in a moment of feeling separate.
It's so profoundly beautiful, and comparing it to thoughts, even right, like the space between the thoughts is just so overwhelmingly beautiful. I know when I inhale, there's a piece of at the end of the inhale, and before I release the breath, there's something that is none of that, in or out. that is so profound, so divine. And it's the same when someone is able to detach from their thinking and feeling. And so, I just want to, can you give a little bit of advice, or what do you do? What is your habits in the day? Just a little ritual that you could possibly share. Maybe it might be a little bit too advanced for people listening here, or the advanced people. What is your rituals in the day? What habits do you have that brings you to that sacred consciousness, to your higher self, that peace, that love that needs no thing?
I have heaps of habits in the day, and I kind of bookend my day with different things. One of the very first things that I do in the day is just like a gratitude practice. And I have a little altar in my house that I kind of tend to, with love as a way to give form to the emotional relationship that I have with the things that are really important to me. I have journaling practices that I do. I have visualization practices that I do. I tend to do my yoga practice at the moment very late at night as the very last thing before I go to bed, with all the lights turned off and just a candle, as a way to kind of bookend my day that way. And I have little things that I do if I realize I'm distracted all day.
Oh, well, I really thank you so much for being on this podcast today. May you be blessed, excuse me, special soul, and may there be peace and love in this world. Thank you for being here, sharing your wisdom, and I hope to see you very soon in the future. Namaste. Thank you.
Namaste. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. Peace and love. I hope you enjoyed this message and feel emotionally moved and touched about it. If you want more of the same, you know what to do. Hit the subscription button and the notification bell, and let's continue creating a ripple effect of love. Thank you.